Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your idea and notion of transnational capitalist class and how it has evolved since you came up with that framing?
Well, most of the research and theorizing about the capitalist class has been focused on the nation state up till quite recently. Although Marx and Engels talked about the international, and Lenin talked about the internationalization of capital and imperialism and so on, it always seemed to end up as a focus on specific nation states. Now, with the invention of the computer and with the tremendous expansion of computerization through the digital economy, the pressure of distance, as we all know, seemed to melt. All that is solid melts into air. This is a very good example of that. So it seemed quite necessary to start looking beyond national boundaries. And from the 1980s onwards, I'm a sociologist, sociologists and political scientists and anthropologists and so on started to discover the linkages across national borders. This also went parallel to ideas about the diminution of the powers of the state as opposed to major transnational corporations. And I suppose the thing that really triggered this off was, in my research for my book, The Transnational Capitalist Class, I reviewed annual reports of major corporations. And Diego, which was a major drinks corporation, had a wonderful map of the world, which didn't delineate the borders of separate countries. It delineated it in terms of what their alcoholic products were doing in different parts of the world. So parts of South America were for their rum products, part of Europe was for their Guinness-like products, and so on and so forth. So this really brought home to me these abstract ideas about the global market and so on. And it brought home to me that it wasn't just the huge countries, the economic powers that were following this strategy, but it was happening all over the world. Now this, of course, didn't mean the end of the state. It didn't mean the end of nationalism. But it meant that we had to wake up to the way in which the capitalist class was changing. And I think I was probably the first person to develop the idea of the transnational capitalist class as a class in itself and for itself. And the way I approached this, which I think offended quite a few orthodox Marxists, was to look at it in terms, first of all, of course, those who own and control the major corporations, the corporate fraction. Then I looked at the state, and I started to call it the state fraction, but then I realized that was rather confusing. So I rebranded that the political fraction. And as I just said in the conference, that the state is a major site of struggle between the globalizing politicians and professionals who, as it were, represent the state in this whole system of capitalist globalization, and they are resisted by various local politicians. Now, the interesting and fascinating thing, of course, is that when election time comes around in parliamentary democracies, all the politicians become more localized. But many of them, and particularly Tony Blair did this very skillfully, represented the benefits for the United Kingdom in terms of Britain's place in the global marketplace. And this was in the late 1990s. And since then, this has become much more of a staple of governmental responses to the problems of democratic election and accountability. You know, if it's good for the relationship between the governments and the transnational the major corporations, then it's good for the country. And of course, it's fascinating to see how Trump will respond to this, because he's, by his very contradictory statements, landed the US right in the middle of this this whole confusion and problem. Another way to look at it, of course, is, and I did this in a book called under the title Globalization, Capitalism and Its Alternatives in 2002, looking at how China and the Chinese leadership fitted in to this transnational capitalist class. So the political fraction, for example, the globalizing political fraction of the transnational capitalist class, were the driving force for China joining the WTO. But of course, there's a lot of resistance in China for this. But basically what's happened is the political fraction of the transnational capitalist class, these globalizing politicians and bureaucrats, have, generally speaking, won the arguments in the political struggles. There are one or two exceptions. For example, trade deals, transnational trade deals. There was one in the early 1990s that was defeated, and of course TTTP, who knows whether Trump will follow through in his promise not to recognize it. So there are fissures and cracks. It's a mistake to see the state or the capitalist class as completely monolithic. So that's the corporate fraction, the political fraction, and then there's the technical fraction, professionals who work for and with the corporate fraction and the political fraction. And then the fourth fraction, which is very often ignored, and that's the consumerist fraction. And that's the way in which advertising, the mass media, become vehicles, I think now we'd call them platforms, for delivering what I've called the culture ideology of consumerism. And we've talked about that quite a lot. In
your more recent work, you have written specifically about the role that architecture, and especially iconic architecture, plays for transnational capitalist class. And I think one of the interesting things I found in one of your recent articles is that you point out that the buildings that much of the media talks about actually not built by architectural firms that build the most buildings. In other words, there are some specific reasons why architects like Rem Koolhaas, for example, attract such an enormous fraction of attention. Could you just explain a little bit more about how you see architecture fitting into this theory?
Well, I'm very pleased you picked up on that point, because one of the reviewers of my manuscript, when I sent it to Oxford University Press, said, well, what difference does it make that the biggest architectural firms in the world, with one exception, and that's Norman Foster's firm, don't produce most of the iconic buildings. But I think it is very important that you have two forms of iconicity. You have the iconic buildings which are represented and produced and created as unique works of art. Of course, there's always this divide within all the cultural industries between the artists and the business people. And architecture has always managed to keep these two in a good tension, as it were, and it continues to do so. So these are unique works of iconic architecture. Now, when I was starting this project and people would ask me at parties, what do you mean? And I would try and explain it and their eyes would glaze over, because it's a difficult concept. So I would say to them, Sydney, and they would immediately say, the Opera House. Now the same thing with Bilbao and so on. So these unique works of architecture become symbolic, emblematic of cities and of a certain way of life, which I try to connect in my work with the cultural ideology of consumerism. Because they're all consumerist buildings. Interestingly, the Opera House, you wouldn't think of that as particularly consumerist, but it's represented as a consumerist hub in Sydney. I don't know if you know Sydney.
Yeah, I've spoken inside Sydney Opera House.
Oh, you
so
have?
It's a conference of ideas also.
Yes, well, that's so you know how consumerist it is. Circular Quay is with the huge cruise ships and so on. Bilbao, Guggenheim Bilbao is emblematic of the same thing. Now, although it's a disturbing building in some ways because of its irregular shape and so on, somehow the Guggenheim Foundation, which of course is a major player in this whole system, managed to project it as both an original work of architecture, which was new and challenging, but also not a threat to people. People didn't have to be intimidated by going into this. And that's how monumental architecture and iconic architecture in the age of capitalist globalization differ, because there's a deliberate attempt not to intimidate. There's a deliberate intent to bring in, to welcome in. And you do this through glass, transparency, which of course is an essential element of modern governmental buildings. You do it through shiny metals because it captures a sort of modernist idea of speed and excitement and encourages people to spend. So that's one side of the iconic architecture debate. The other side is what I call typical iconic architecture. That is buildings normally not by iconic architects, although sometimes Frank Gehry produces both types of buildings. But these are buildings that when you look at them, you think, aha, this reminds me of something. What does it remind me of? It reminds me of one of the great unique architectural icons. So it gets a sort of reflected glow from this memory that people have had because they've been bombarded with media images of the iconic buildings. You know, Walter Benjamin wrote this wonderful article, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Now, maybe I should have called my book Iconic Architecture in the Age of Digital Reproduction, because in some ways that's what it's about. And just to round out the argument, I use the concept of the enigmatic signifier to signify the difference between unique icons, like the Sydney Opera House, and copies. And there are buildings all around the world. But actually the easiest example is the example of railway stations. Calatrava has been involved with bridges, transportation hubs and so on, and his buildings are seen as very iconic. But all over the world you'll have knockoffs of Calatrava's buildings. So people remember, they have an image of what Calatrava had done. And in their little towns and cities, they've also got something that looks something like that. And has the same effect in terms of the cultural ideology of consumerism. It gives an excitement. It welcomes people in. It encourages them to spend. And what unique icons do is they are allowed to have multiple signifiers, but they always have to have an element of the consumerist in the enigmatic signifiers. My favorite building is Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum in New York. And that's a very good example of what happens to museums in the age of capitalist globalization, with the expansion of the shops, the restaurants, the cafes, the brand stretching. You know, you go into the shop in any museum and you find hundreds of consumer goods that are branded with the museum. That's all part of the cultural ideology of consumerism.
I just want to talk a little bit about the solutions to the crisis that you outline in much of your work, which on the one hand is a crisis of capitalism, on the other hand is a crisis of the hierarchical state. And one of the solutions you've been proposing has been that of digitally networked consumer producer cooperatives. I would just be curious to hear you explain that concept, but also to try to emphasize the ways in which it differs from existing mainstream efforts at cooperativism, because clearly there are many, especially here in Southern Europe, where we are at the moment.
Like many people on the left, I don't consider myself a Marxist. Like Marx himself, of course, famously said, I'm not a Marxist. But I'm certainly Marx-inspired. And Marx made two very important points about alternatives to capitalism. Now, a lot of this material is not widely known, partly because it's in manuscript forms, but now it's beginning to get more known. I'm not suggesting, of course, just because Marx said it has to be true. I'm just suggesting that it made me think differently when I start to read this stuff. The first idea is much more commonly known, and that is that in order to escape capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, you have to abolish socially necessary labour time, wage labour, basically, which means the abolition of money, it means the abolition of the division of labour, and it means just thinking about the world and thinking about your place in the world in a totally different way to the way in which the cultural ideology of consumerism encourages us to think. That is, that we're here to buy stuff, to enjoy stuff, and to basically ignore the ecological consequences of our behaviour. The second idea was something, there's a lot of controversy about Marx's reaction to the Paris Commune. Now, I don't want to get too much into bibliographic disputes, but apparently Marx made a revision to his report on the Paris Commune, which was deleted from its publication in the early 1870s when he first wrote it. And this was basically questioning the idea of the worker state. Of course, Marx and Engels famously predicted communist revolution, the worker state, the proletarian revolution. His experience with the Paris Commune seems to suggest that he thought that the state form had to be completely rethought. And Marx also talks about cooperatives in a rather guarded fashion, but basically somewhat positive. Because I think Marx realized, as we have to realize today, that the consumer cooperative is simply just another form of the capitalist mode of production, because it is deeply linked in to the capitalist market, to socially necessary labour time, to the money economy. Now, what I'm proposing is that if we want to transcend the present crisis, we have to think more seriously about what it means to escape and challenge capitalism. Now, you can't challenge capitalism or the state, in my view, head on. Violent revolution seems to me always to have ended in disaster for the people who it was supposed to represent, the ordinary worker. And the history of the 19th and 20th century and the 21st century shows us this, I think, quite clearly. So how do we do this in a non-violent fashion? We first of all have to escape from the capitalist market. Now, the cultural ideology of consumerism, which is the motive force of the capitalist market and the capitalist mode of production, and is what the transnational capitalist class exists to promote eternally and to demonstrate that there's no alternative to it. The only way I can see to escape from that is to simply avoid the capitalist market, to start creating ways of establishing resilient communities which can, with the help of socialist politicians, elected officials and so on, helping them, facilitating this, create viable alternatives. Now, at the conference here, I've learned that there are one or two very promising initiatives in this respect. There are millions, of course, examples of consumer cooperatives and even somewhat producer-consumer cooperatives which exist in parallel to the capitalist market. For example, let's take the essentials, produce your own food. Now, there are lots of cooperatives which are helped by the state, who provide seeds and all that you need to produce food. And that's a good first step. But in the last resort, you're still locked into the capitalist marketplace. You're still locked into the world of Monsanto. You're still locked into the world of Deere tractors and so on. So maybe it's a first step to show people what might be possible. But in order to escape capitalism, You have to start producing your own foods. You have to start creating your own tractors. I know that you were skeptical about the global village construction set and open source ecology, and you're right to be skeptical. But I don't see why the left can't embrace the technology involved here. What about the state? It's extremely difficult to escape the state. So in a transition period, I can envisage people working within the state system and the market system, supporting their family members or their neighbours, the people in their communities, their comrades, to start to build these producer-consumer cooperatives. Now, it's going to be extremely difficult. So why do I have these extreme ideas? I will answer in one word: the Anthropocene. That's 2 words. Now, geologists are starting to tell us that the planet, our home, the Earth, is entering a phase which they call the Anthropocene epoch. So the Holocene, which came before it as a geological phenomenon, is being replaced. Now, what the Anthropocene epoch means is that human activities are starting to impact on the geology of the planet in a very harmful, destructive fashion. If you want 2 concrete examples of this, the fossil fuel economy, which is extraordinarily destructive and polluting. And the second example would be nuclear radiation, which is beginning to change the way the planet works. Now, we will not see the worst of this. Our grandchildren probably won't see the worst of this, but maybe our grandchildren's grandchildren. And I don't mean the biological parents. I mean people taking seriously their obligations to all the children, all the babies in their community. So that's why I talk about something that usually doesn't enter these debates: love-based parenting. The way in which parenting can affect the brains of children. So we have to grasp onto all these things and try to develop a dynamic for our children and our grandchildren to see some hope in the future. Because as we see at the moment with the Paris climate talks, and all over the world climate talks, where delegates really stupidly get to their feet and cheer because governments around the world have said yes to non-binding agreements to reduce emissions and so on, which is really pathetic. Now, I'll be dead by the time my grandchildren's grandchildren look back, if they have the opportunity to do so, as the planet is disintegrating before our very eyes. Why did they do this? Were they too interested in checking their mobile phones to realize we are in grave danger? Now, I know the world is in grave danger from all sorts of threats, but this is a danger of planetary survival. And we don't have time to go into the class analysis of the Anthropocene, but this also is important, maybe for another time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.